All right, hello everyone. Hello everyone. And just setting up here, making sure I got everything going. So we're gonna do some more bug stuff today. So I hope you're excited. You know I am. And I want to start with just talking about where I left off last time. So last Wednesday, 7:30 p.m. Pacific time, I did a live stream, and I focused mostly on the forewings and doing the wing veining. That was the primary thing. So rather than, well, the next step is to work on the hind wings, right? And the hind wings is the same idea. They're going to have wing veins and that kind of stuff. So rather than kind of rehash what I did last week, because I want to keep moving forward on this, what I did is I worked on the hind wings, and here they are. And I also changed the legs because I wasn't really happy with the way the legs looked. I'm still not totally happy with them, but I think these are better than what they were last week. This is the legs last week, which I thought was kind of boring. And this is the legs this week, which I think is a little bit more interesting. I'm still kind of messing with the proportions, but I really want to focus on detailing today. However, I know there's some people who really do want to see like every step of the process and they don't want to miss anything. So what I did is I recorded a video and posted it on YouTube if you want to see how I did the hind wing. So it's kind of like a time lapse, and also what I did on the legs. And so if you go to my YouTube channel, which is at Bluepatone, so my YouTube channel is at Bluepatone right here. You can see I recorded this video, and I know I'm doing a YouTube over YouTube, but it kind of goes through the process of what I did with the wings. So it's a nice review, and you'll also see some how I did the veins. This is a review of how I do wing veins for insects, and then also the changes that I made to the legs. So if you want to check that out on my YouTube channel, please feel free to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to go forward, and we're going to talk about detailing today, which is actually like one of my favorite parts of the entire process. I love detailing. That's why I got into ZBrush in the first place. And as usual, I'm going to start with the head. And now I did some detailing a while back, a little bit, but I want to get more into it. So let's take a look at some models I've done in the past just to see, you know, where we're headed. And then I wanted to say a few things about bugs in general. There's lots of different ways that you can detail your bug models. Since I do spend a lot of time trying to accurately model real bugs in the real world, you get a lot of inspiration. So here is a rainbow scarab beetle I did a few years ago. And this is an actual living organism. It's a type of dung beetle. It's really wild looking. It's also very colorful. But you notice the detailing on it is really interesting. It's got this kind of like weird kind of wormy structure on the surface, you know, that is kind of fun. You know, you can see this in the head and the other parts of the front of the beetle. But then if you look at like this big horn, you can see that it has kind of a characteristic pitting that you'll see in a lot of insects if you look really close at them. And you see that this one, you know, I was trying to kind of do an analysis of how these details work. This one has kind of a mixture of very fine details and then kind of somewhat uniform, similar size, larger pits that are randomly placed but somewhat evenly spaced. In other words, you don't see two of them like really close together or really far apart. They're almost sort of equidistant. And I do a little smoothing here to kind of indicate wear and tear. So when you're looking at bugs, look for those kinds of interesting patterns, and you can come up with your own rules for how the insect detailing works. So if you look at the elytra here on this beetle, you can see it's very different from what we see in the front of the head. This is kind of like a more of a squiggly stripe with some noise in between. And I use a lot of surface noise to get these kinds of effect, and I'll do that tonight as well as I work on the wasp. And then you can see on the other underside, beetles are really wild. They're very complex, especially the underside. You get a wide variety of details. It's not just the same thing over the entire model. It changes depending on what part of the anatomy we're looking at. So let me go down here real quick and turn off some of these textures. This is just, the colors you see here are just the UV texture thing. So I'm going to go down here to textures, and I'm going to turn off textures, and then go down here and apply last function to all subtools, and hopefully it'll turn them all off. But you can see, like, we have like large pits right here with some noise, and we have kind of a combination of sort of stripiness, and then maybe like a finer noise on these parts right here, and then the parts of the mouth. This one has such a wild mouth that it's worth taking a look at. You know, it's like everything is under the shield. It's almost like a horseshoe crab in the fact that we have this large carapace and then a lot of the details underneath. And check out the antenna on this stuff. It's really crazy, and I'm not making this up. You know, I actually got some of these. I ordered them, you know, dead ones in the mail, and then, you know, looked at them under a microscope and spent a lot of time on this. Notice that half of the eye is visible underneath, and then the other half is visible above, which is really wild. So I think the world looks very strange to these beetles. So some cool stuff there for inspiration. And then one of my favorites, of course, is the Acromyrmex, which is basically a leafcutter ant. Let me see if we can find it here. That's our wasp. A older version of the wasp. Here's a katydid. Let's take a look at this. And again, I'm going to go texture map, texture off to turn it off, and then subtools. Apply last action to all subtools, meaning turn off all the textures for all the subtools. So this is one that I did for actually a VR project a while back for an Italian university. So it's kind of a VR exploration of a tree and all the different life forms that live on the tree. So you can see in this case, you see a lot of very fine detail on here, and some kind of cracks and that kind of stuff, especially around these areas around the eyes. You can see this kind of detail right here, which is a lot of fun to sculpt. But, you know, the detail has a personality to it. We look at the wings, you can see all the little sculpted detail that I did on here, as well as some of the fine detail. And again, used a lot of noise plug-in, surface noise, to do this kind of stuff. So we'll be doing some of that. So some cool inspiration there on this katydid. They're really cool insects, one of my favorites. Kind of related to grasshoppers. You can find the really huge ones in Indonesia. Let's see, and then we have this one. It's give it a second. And this, of course, is a cicada. And lots of cool detail on here. Nice inspiration. That's why I think it's a great idea to really spend some time doing some bugs and trying to get them as accurate as possible. Looking at the underside of the abdomen here, you have a combination of this noise, but you see these streaks kind of imply a little bit of a tension as, you know, as these bugs grow, they molt every so many stages. The stages are called instars. So the stage in between a molt is called an instar. Depending on the type of bugs, like you don't see a lot of ants molting, adult ants molting, but adult other bugs like cicadas and stuff, you'll see their molts and everything. And so as the bug is aging, of course, it's getting bigger, and at a certain point it outgrows its exoskeleton, and that's when it molts. It kind of sheds that and then emerges and develops a new exoskeleton. So you kind of want to imply this tension of this growing and this expanding of the exoskeleton in your details and your bugs. I mean, it almost looks kind of like you see muscular detail on a fleshy character or a monster, but this is actually a hard surface. It's not fleshy or soft. With the exception of flies. If you're looking at flies, their abdomens do tend to be kind of fleshy, kind of like the larva and that kind of stuff. So more inspiration there that we'll be drawing on, and then I want to find, of course, one of my favorite bugs, the leafcutter ant, with some really wild detail. And this is actually a really old model of mine. I did this a long time ago, one of my favorites. But just so you know, I'm not making this up. We could take a look at a reference here. This is a leafcutter Acromyrmex. You can see the kind of detailing we get on this. And another one. So If you look at something like a mantis, you're going to see a smoother kind of quality to it. The detail is a lot finer, but you can see these areas of tension here, the different parts of the face, and then along these edges here. Here's a katydid in full color. Of course, it's not really high resolution, so you can kind of see. You see how each bug has its own personality in terms of the detailing, the noise and stuff. Here's a great example of tiger beetle, of kind of these long sort of streaky lines that almost form like a fingerprint pattern. And I do have I have done a tiger beetle before. They're really fun. And then of course you have like a leaf mantis, you know, when they're imitating the camouflage of other. Here's a katydid. So you can see that kind of stuff going on. Anywho, scorpion tail is great because you can see on these ridges here how it has these little spikities that kind of follow along and really give a sense of composition to the organism itself. And I've done like a few scorpions before, and they're really fun. Another great thing to notice when talking about scorpions is in between each segment of the tail, you do see some fleshy bits here that are kind of exposed. And when you're texturing, that sort of creamy kind of translucence kind of interspersed between the dark exoskeleton, really it adds the realism. It makes it look really, really cool. So if you're dying to do some fleshy bits when you're doing insects, you can look for those spaces in between the parts of the carapace to get the ideas. And then of course if you're doing like bees, you're going to get a lot of hair, fuzziness, and that kind of stuff. Here's a leafhopper, shiny, kind of almost Darth Vader-like kind of quality to it with some bumpities and bubbles. So here's a good example of like, you can see the reflection of the hairs on here, which creates kind of an interesting image, but then you also get these kind of like bubble details and a very, very shiny, smooth, bright specular highlight. These things are just so wild. I don't know where they come from. Oh, this, by the way, Andreas K. He's passed away, unfortunately. Very famous photographer, one of my favorites. I used to follow him all the time. And just wonderful videos and photography. So get a chance to look him up because he's got all of these images come from him. Here's a great grasshopper. Look at the detail on that thing. Right? Sorry, I'm going off on this stuff because I can't help it. I do want to point out another one of my favorite photographers. That's where I get a lot of my inspiration. Give me a second here to minimize this and take a look at chats. And so there's a really great book by one of my favorite photographers and scientists, Peter Niedzwiecki. The name of the book is Smaller Majority. He also has a website and blog called The Smaller Majority. He's a Harvard scientist. I've gone on a few bugshot workshops with him, including to Mozambique. He spends a lot of time in Mozambique at Gorongosa Park taking pictures. He takes pictures of all kinds of animals, but he does specialize in katydids and bats. So you might want to follow him on Instagram or check out some of his books. And his name, let me see if I can get the spelling of it, is Peter Niedzwiecki, right here. Just a really wonderful person and amazing photographer and somebody worth following and reading some of his books. His books are some of my favorite references. So check him out, smallermajority.com. Worth a visit. Little plug for him. And then one more plug before we get started. I do have a series on the Gnomon Workshop. I have several series on the Gnomon Workshops involving insects and spiders. This is one of my more recent ones, creature modeling with ZBrush and Marmoset tool bag. I do an orchid mantis, and I do it all the way from beginning, Z-spheres, all the way to final render in Marmoset, poly painting, texturing, the whole bit. So check that out on the Gnomon Workshop. And then I have another one which is all about jumping spiders and working with Yeti for hair. So again, plenty of content there, all the way from beginning in ZBrush to final render in Redshift for Maya with Yeti. And then this is a slightly older one. This is another wasp. This is hyper-realistic insect design where I also kind of make up a bug as I go along, kind of like what I'm doing on this live series. And this one I think is rendered in Octane. I've kind of moved over to Redshift recently. I just really like Redshift. It's easy to use. And of course now it's part of ZBrush. But this one was done in Octane for users of Octane. And again, goes all the way from Z-spheres to final render in Maya. So check that out if you get a chance in the Gnomon Workshop. And now it's time to start having some fun. So, as I often do, I'm going to start with the head. So maybe go in here to, well, actually, let's talk a little bit about some techniques for creating noise brushes, which is always a lot of fun. So I'm going to shift over to a good old-fashioned sphere here and just talk about some cool techniques. Now, you guys are probably aware of surface noise. Let's subdivide this a few times. So I'll go over some noise techniques here. So I'm going to get this up to, let's do like 6 million polygons, just so we have plenty to work with here. And take a quick sip of beer. And I'll talk first about designing some noise. And this is just a very brief overview because you can really get into this topic. I know, okay, so let's go into the tool palette and we're going to go down here. We're going to go down here to surface. And if I just turn on noise, we get this window, which you guys are probably familiar with. And it creates an overall noise to the entire surface of the model. So we're seeing a preview of it here in this window. We don't see anything in here yet. But we can go in here and start to make adjustments with this graph by dragging on these dots. So remember, if I have a dot here and I drag it all the way off, I can remove the dot, or I can click on here to add dots and I can just start messing with it like this. I can also create straight lines here by clicking off and dragging back on here again. And what this graph is doing is it's kind of changing the way that the noise is projected on the surface. If I go up here to the noise scale and increase the scale, now we can see a little bit better what's going on as I adjust these dots on this graph, right? Now if I just say OK, what we get is we get a surface noise, but this is technically a bump map. In other words, it's not actually applied to the surface. If I get something like the inflate brush and I start drawing on this, right, you can see the noise is consistent across the entire surface, even when I get these like weird intersections. And that is because the noise is being projected as a bump map. It's not actually on the surface. If I turn noise off, we go back to our smooth geometry, right? Now, if I go to the surface subpalette here, without actually going into this, if I do want to change this noise, I could just hit edit and then go in here and make changes. You know, change the strength, how it's applied, whether it's using a mask and so on, even change the angle and just mess with all this kind of stuff and say okay. But if I go into the surface and I say apply to mesh, now it's baked into the surface. So this now is actually part of the geometry, right? So if I turn noise on again and edit, then I'm going to be editing noise on top of that noise, right? So the couple layers of noise, and I can choose apply to mesh, and you get nice noisy surface, right? I'm going to go back a step here and another step back to this. So this is before I apply to the mesh. So we're back to the bump map. The other thing we could do is I can choose mask by noise, and now it's going to create a mask based on that noise. Let's go back to a smooth sphere here. There we go. If I do mask by noise, now we just have a mask, and I'll use this as well. You can invert the mask, and so on. Let's invert the mask, and then if I go in here and like do a reverse inflate or an inflate right there, you can see now the noise is kind of localized, and I can smooth it as I work with the mask still applied. And this is how I get some of the details that I put on my surface, right? And then if I clear the mask, we have no more mask, and I can smooth it further, shift down a couple subdivision levels, do some smoothing and do some blending, redivide, and you get this. So you get a nice variation there, right? So this is the basics of working with surface noise. Now, of course, the other thing you can do is there's a lot going on in that noise plugin palette. So let's go back to nice smooth sphere. Let's say here, clear the mask, and go back into the surface noise. So choose noise, edit, and this time instead of the regular noise, I'm going to go into the noise plugin. But first, let's do this. I'm going to reset that graph, and I'm going to choose noise plug. And now we get this, which is a whole bunch of different other types of noise. And if you've seen this in my previous live streams, I used a hex tile to create this the look of the eyes, the hexagon pattern on the eyes of the ommatidia. But you have all these other different procedural noises, and they've also added in 2024 Maxon noise. Maxon in Cinema 4D has a really nice tool set or suite of procedural noises, and now they've introduced this or integrated it into ZBrush. So if I click on noise, then I can go down here and I have a drop down menu of all these other different noises. So if I do like wavy turbulence, for example, and then I choose OK, and then we can go in here. I'm going to set the mix basic noise to 0 so that the only thing I'm looking at is the noise plugin. And now I'm going to play with the scale and see if we can get it to actually show up. Okay, there we go. So I had to mess with the strength a little bit for it to show up, but now I can go in here and change the plugin scale and get this type of swirly goo, which is really nice. And again, I can also use this graph to edit it. And again, I could apply it to the surface or just create a mask or whatever. So you're getting a really kind of cool look here, right? And then maybe I'll choose OK and apply to mesh. And now I have this, which is very cool, right? So that again is all found in noise plug. And I've noticed with this, the noise plug, it's like when you click on edit, you get yet another pop-up menu. And you'll definitely have to mess with the scale and the strength a little bit when using these before you start to see something show up. So if you don't see anything, it doesn't mean it's not working. It just means that you might have to adjust the scale relative to the object or the strength, etc. Right? So that's the Maxon noise. And now what I want to show you very quickly is the noise brush. So what we've been working with now is in the tool palette, surface noise, right? But if I go into the brush palette, there's also a noise brush. So let's bring on the brush menu to see what's going on here. So I'm going to dock the brush menu and just sculpt on my surface. Now I get this noisy surface or noisy brushstroke, right? But you'll notice this is actually being applied to the surface. It's not a bump map. It's actually deforming the geometry of the surface. And we're getting this kind of thing, which is cool. This is very insect noise. I notice a lot of times when I apply these things and then I do some smoothing, that's when you get this. The smoothing creates that really insectoid-like kind of quality to it. But I want to show you the controls very quickly to this. If I go into the brush palette, so now I'm in the brush palette as opposed to the tool palette. This is the tool palette, this is the brush palette. In the brush palette, I also have surface, and this looks a lot like this menu right here. If I choose edit, guess what? I get a very similar pop-up that I did over here in the surface noise with also similar kind of graph. It's got this red line here that allows you to determine this is the surface of the model, so this would be going in. If I pull out, everything's going out. I could change the scale, I can change the strength, and so on. And I can go into noise plug, and guess what? I've got the same options here. So maybe I'll go to Maxon noise, and this time I'll choose, instead of, I can't remember what I chose last time, I'll choose one of these other wacky ones. How about sparse convoluted? Or, oh, that one's kind of interesting, and I'll choose OK. And then I can go in here and change the strength. It's maybe too strong. And maybe change this. Let's say I like that. I choose OK. Now when I brush on the surface, Let's make sure that I get nice Z intensity here. And bring down the draw size. Alrighty, way to make me look dumb. I'll go in here and edit it, and let's bring up the strength again. Let's actually choose a different one. Let's choose. Let's go back to that wavy turbulence. Kind of like that one. Wavy turbulence. And bring the scale down to 1 here. And bring in the scale. And maybe bring down the strength a little bit. And maybe bring this above the surface. There we go. And let's go bring the plug-in scale down to like that. And let's give this a try. Okay, that's a lot better. So you can see now I'm drawing on the surface and I'm getting the noise just where I sculpt. The other cool thing about this is the local projection mode. Right now, it's the scale of the noise is always the same no matter how big or small my draw size is, right? Make a really large draw size, you know, I'm getting more intense, but it's still the same scale. If I do local projection mode, then what I can do is I can change the scale of the noise based on the draw size. All right, so this is a great way to kind of get variation as you're working on your model. Again, you can get that kind of like, you know, noise within noise. So very cool stuff there. So that's a lot of options you can use for doing noise on the surface to get cool insect like designs on the exoskeleton. The base startup material is called Ma Dirty Blue. It's M-A-H Dirty Blue, and you can find it on ZBrush, the Pixelogic website. In their downloads, they have a material library. You might have to hunt around for it a bit on the internet because the Maxon website has moved a lot of this stuff around. But I talk about it in some of the previous live streams on YouTube. We get into the materials where you can download it. It's just basically kind of like a variation of a wax material without the subsurface, but it's called Ma Dirty Blue. You could also probably just go in here and, you know, do a Google search for Ma Dirty Blue. And yeah, do a Google search for Ma Dirty Blue, and then click on this right here under matte caps. Go down here to matte. And it is right here. See, there are 2 versions of it right here. Click on this and then you can download it, install it into ZBrush, and you are good to go. But it's a great material. It's the one that I like because it really brings out the details well, and it doesn't wear out the eyes too much. So hopefully that answers your question. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of surface detail is one of the extractor brushes, because I use this quite a bit as well. So maybe what I'll do is, let's go back to a smooth sphere, and I'm going to go back to this noise and choose edit and that noise plugin, and let's do that Maxon noise, and let's do that I don't know, Cell Voronoi, and let's get rid of mix basic noise and set that to 0. Bring up the strength on this, and then plug-in scale. I don't like that one. Let's do a different one. Let's do maybe turbulence. I like that one. Get the strength going. Play with this a little bit. Something like this. Okay. Let's say do that, and then I'm going to do apply to mesh. So I just wanted to get some kind of noise on there. So you could do this with any kind of detail. It could be sculpted detail. In fact, let's do that. I'm going to go in here and get the Damien standard brush, and I'm going to set this to spray and set the placement really high, and maybe something like this for the alpha. Okay. And bring down the draw size. Maybe not that much. Bring down the Z intensity. So get something like this. So just something kind of a mixture of that surface noise plus the plus some sculpted noise. And so this is sometimes how I design noise for bugs. I'll go in here and create something. I'll look at my reference and then go on like a sphere like this one and say, okay, let's see if I can imitate what I see in my reference. In this case, I'm just doing kind of random stuff. And maybe I'll just do a little smoothing here. And just a little bit more, just to really make it crazy. Okay, something like that, right? Now I'm going to go into the brush palette and I'm going to press X so I can just see these brushes right here, the extractor brushes. And I'm going to use this one right here, the extractor. This allows you to grab detail as well as poly paint from a model and you turn it into a brush, right? So it's another way to create a custom brush. First thing you want to do before do anything else though is I'm going to store an undo history state. So I'm going to go up here to the undo history bar, hold control and click on this to store that state. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my draw size up a little bit and I'm going to press the G hotkey. So I'm going to press G and you'll see that my brush turns light blue, right? So that means it's in capture mode. And now I'm just going to drag a line down here across the surface and give it a few seconds and you can see it's created this custom alpha. And now if I go to, let's say, I'll go to another model. Let's just do W and I'll do a polyplane and it's, let's subdivide this a few times just to get enough polygons. Let's get it up to say 4 million, right? And now my extractor brush, I'm going to go back to draw mode. So I have my extractor brush, you can see the alpha here. Now if I draw on this, guess what? I get this repeating pattern that I just captured. And maybe if I lower the draw size, then it lowers it as well. Increase the draw size. So this is a great way to quickly create custom brushes, right? And you can sample, you know, anything in ZBrush, and it can also have poly paint as well. It'll create texture. And so what you could do is say, you know, brush, save as, and then you save it as a ZBP file. That's a ZBrush brush preset. If I save it in, let's see, if I go into my C drive and program files, and oops, I was going to the wrong one. Sorry, just regular program files. Thank you. Go down here to Maxon. Let's see, Maxon ZBrush 2024. I'm still using the beta. If I go into Z Startup, brush presets, and I'll call this Googly or something like that. Then when I start up ZBrush, it'll always be in here as one of the brush presets. If I save it into that folder. So you can create a whole series of brushes for the different insects that you create. If you get some kind of design on your surface that you really like and you want to use that for a different model, create an extractor brush. The other extractor brushes are similar, they just have a different stroke style. So we have extractor dot and extractor drag rect. So if I go to extractor dot, and this time I'll store this undo history state, and I'll choose G. It's going to allow me to drag it, but it's going to be drag dot as opposed to brush stroke. So it's going to be slightly different. And then the other one is going to be the, let's see, drag rect. So if I, again, still stored that history state, so that's fine. Press the G hotkey and then sample this. Now I get this kind of thing. I can drag out like this. So it's really just different stroke styles. So, but it's a really useful technique. So let's go back to our bugs, and with the, yes, the brush, when you save the brush, it will save that custom alpha as well. So you can load it up anytime you want. So a great example, let's do it here on my Acromyrmex, if she does not mind, just to sort of bring this, to highlight this. And so the head here is 5 million. So I'm going to store this undo history state. Let's go back to our extractor brush. I called it Googly. I'm going to increase the draw size, press G, and sample this. So you're going to see we have a different alpha now. I'll go back to my plane. And there you go. See that same kind of surface quality that I got from that ant is now on here. And if I save that, it will be available next time I load that brush into ZBrush with the alpha. And also, if you have something that has like poly paint on it, like I've done this before for wood textures, where I've created a wood texture brush just from, actually a really good techniques is if you use Megascans, right? So a great example is I wanted to create a bone brush because, believe it or not, I was sculpting something other than a bug. And so I wanted to create a bunch of different brushes that captured the texture of bone. So what I did is I load up some of the Megascans bone models here in ZBrush, convert the texture to poly paint, right? Make sure it's really high resolution so that detail is there. And then I use the extractor brushes to sample not only the details on the bone, the scanned bone, but also the textures that come with that bone. And then I got a bunch of bone brushes. So that's a really great way to build a library from like, say, Megascans or other models you may have downloaded. All right, it's time for a sip of beer. And then we're going to get into some bug sculpting. Stay in school, kids. Okay. I don't need to save the project. Let's go into our wasp. And maybe what I'll do is I'm going to start by sculpting on this mandible here. And I'll hit the solo button. So this is already, let me see, highest, I've got 5 subdivisions level, so this is the lowest subdivision level, so that's 520 points, and let's divide it, get it up to 2 million is probably a good place to start. Let's take a look at some reference, just to get some inspiration. Now I got this, or I was inspired to do this design from an existing mud dauber wasp. So you can see here's a lovely picture of it from the internet. So you can see it's got some hairs on it. Notice that the hairs do line up with these little pits right here. So, and you can use that. You can sculpt the pits in here, and I'll show you how you can use fiber mesh and masking to place hairs into each one of those pits. It's not super exact, but it's good enough usually and easy enough to edit. So I kind of want to, I'm looking at this. I got some sort of scoring right here, some lateral kind of scratches. I've got kind of this kind of interesting, along the edges here, some thickness here, some wearing and tearing, but I also have some pitting and then some larger lines and then the areas where the hair comes out. So those are all things that I'm kind of looking at. And you can see I kind of started to do that when I was doing the model earlier. I think I sculpted this in the first or second in this series, if you want to go back and watch the older live streams. All right, let's let it autosave. And let's let it crash. Why not? We'll wait for it to respond. And in the meantime, we'll have a sip of beer. I've got a lot of models in here, so the autosave is going to be a large project. All right, worst case scenario, we're going to have to reload it. How's everybody doing tonight? There we go. Okay, so let's start sculpting. And so usually, I kind of like I have here, I usually start with the larger details, like I was implying some teeth down here. So I'm going to get out one of my favorites, brushes, which is the SK cloth. SK stands for Sakuri. I can never pronounce his name, and I apologize. And once again, because I want to give him a shout out. He's actually a live streamer here on Pixelogic. Sakaki Karo. I'm sorry, I'm mangling the pronunciation of your name. He's got some great brushes. I highly recommend it. You can download it, send him some money. They're my favorite brushes, so highly recommend it. Also check out his live stream because he does amazing stuff. He's more character based. But I like this brush because it just creates these very lovely, elegant lines. I used to use Damien's standard brush for a lot of this kind of stuff, but I kind of switched to this type of brush, or this particular brush. And so I'm just kind of creating some of those larger scoring details to start with. Maybe kind of, and I like to keep it nice and loose and organic, right? So I'm going to kind of go in here, and so I'm drawing and also smoothing. So I'm going to go into the brush palette. I'm going to hold the shift key and go down to the smooth brush modifiers and set my alt brush size to a larger size. That means that when I hold the shift key, my smooth brush is larger than the draw size of my regular drawing. And I like that because it kind of just smooths out the area a little bit more. So I'm kind of alternating drawing and then holding the alt key to kind of click in and overlapping those strokes just a little bit to create kind of nice organicness. I'm going to bring out some of these details a bit more. All right, something like that. I'm going to make these a little bit sharper, so these are actually kind of the teeth. So maybe I'll switch over to a move brush here and just drag these out just a little bit, make them a bit more menacing. Oops. I know that a long time ago I sculpted and animated a fire ant, Solenopsis invicta, which is really cool. That's the one. That's the red fire ant that terrorizes the southern United States. It actually was imported by accident from South America, and has since kind of taken over the South here. But I did a sculpt of it a while back and an animation, kind of describing how the venom of that particular ant works, and you can see it on my website, Entomology Animated. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that I worked really hard at trying to get an accurate model, but I got an email at one point from an entomologist who noted that I had the wrong number of teeth on the mandibles. So they're really paying close attention to that. So for particular species, you have to be careful. If you're trying to do an accurate model, make sure you're getting the right number of teeth, because that's one of those identifiers that entomologists use to distinguish one species from another. I fixed it, of course, and then actually met him on a bug shot, which is really nice. A really nice guy. One of the, I talked about references a lot in my last live stream. The one thing that I neglected to mention, because I talked about, I use Google image searches, I use books, I go out in the field, I take my own pictures, and I watch videos and all this kind of stuff, and I get specimens and I look at them under the microscope. The one reference that I think is really important that I neglected to mention is actual scientists, actual entomologists. They're some of the best sources of information. So if you can go to your local natural history museum, like I know Brian Brown, who is a fly specialist over here in the LA Natural History Museum, as well as Lisa Gonzalez and Emily Hartop and a few others. And so they're friends of mine, and because I started going to the museum and I met them and asked a bunch of questions and started participating in some of the museum entomology related events. But it's great to be able to just email somebody with a question and get a good answer, or find out whether something is completely off, or maybe something that nobody actually knows. But it's always interesting. And I've met a lot of scientists that way. They're one of the most valuable resources for reference. You guys know that they hire scientists frequently on movies to as consultants, and then they don't listen to them. Somebody once told me that they were a consultant, or they knew a consultant who was hired on The Scorpion King. Remember that movie starring The Rock? Some of the worst CG in the history of all of CG. So it's worth seeing just to see how bad it is. But they were hired as a consultant, and the director kept asking questions about the eyes of the scorpion, because this whole shot they wanted to do with the scorpion eyes. And the entomologist was like, scorpion eyes are like little light sensors. They don't really work. They don't use their eyes much at all. And of course, the director was very disappointed in that answer. It's like, really? Too bad, man. So I'm just kind of and now, I'm playing with these ideas and creating happy accidents here. Like I say, this is why it's my favorite part of the whole process. And then what I might do is on top of this, a little squiggly, nervous noise. Again, I'm just using the SK cloth brush for everything here. Let's take a look at the other side here. When I think about this, I'm thinking about what it's going to look like when it's finally rendered here, when I'm creating the shaders. And I like I said, I render with Redshift these days. So I think about when I'm sculpting these details, how the light is going to interact with the details on the surface. Because these things tend to be nice and shiny. And that's what the specularity is what's going to reveal these forms more than anything else. Getting the inflate brush with the low Z intensity and going in here and just creating a little bit of sub bumps, I guess. So it's a bit more organic. Again, smoothing it out a little bit. That's a nice way to get some quick organic qualities to this, so imperfections. And of course, since I made these mandibles asymmetrical, I'm going to have to kind of remember the way I'm going about creating these details so I can duplicate it on the other mandible. But, with some differences to it, so it's interesting. These chompers are probably used for not only, suppressing prey, but also for nest building, right? So this is probably chewing through some, if I'm basing this on a mud dauber, then mud daubers are actually manipulating, mud, to create their nests. So it's going to have some wear and tear on it from doing that. Let's smooth that out a little bit. Sometimes I'll go down a couple subdivision levels and just hit it with a smooth brush just to knock it down a little bit so it's not so overwhelming. Because you also want to have some flatter areas to reflect the light, and also places where you can put fine detail. And then go back up again. Leave this, which looks pretty good. Let's do a little save next. Then I'm going to let's play with some of that surface noise a little bit. So I'm going here to surface noise and zoom in on this. Let's hit the frame button. There we go. So I think what I want to do here is I want to create kind of fine level of noise. Something like this. Maybe I'll even bring down the scale a little bit. and use the graph to kind of create a little bit more space there. Something like this. Maybe I said the strength in the opposite direction, so it's kind of going in a bit more. Something like this. And I'll choose OK. And I'll choose Apply to Mesh. So just kind of like a little bit of a fine detail. Like if I feel like this isn't strong enough, I can go into the stroke palette and with that Adjust Last slider, maybe bring this up a little bit more. Just be aware when you hit the Adjust Last, it's going to turn the noise back on again. I don't know if that's a bug or what, but I'll turn that off. But here's the result. So that looks pretty good. It's just kind of a subtle bit of noise. You can hit, if I hit it with the smooth brush, it kind of gets a little gone. But I think what I want to do now is take a look at this, and I want to create some of these areas where I can have hairs coming out. So little dots. Yeah, the other great movie for incredibly bad CG from that era, of course, is Wild Wild West. That's a classic in terribleness. They actually do have a tarantula hawk wasp animation in there that's really, really terrible. It's worth checking out if you like watching bad stuff and cringing. It's the C in CG stands for cringe, I guess. Okay, so I'm gonna get my Damien Standard brush, and I'm going to set this to drag rect and brush alpha there. That's probably pretty good. Let's bring up the Z intensity a little bit. And let's see, my geometry is 2 million. Yeah, that's probably good. So I'm going to kind of create, let's undo that. Make sure the surface noise is still on. Okay. And kind of create an uneven row here. I don't want these to be exactly the same size. I want a little bit of variation and also not in a perfectly straight line. Smaller down here, a little bit closer together. One of my new favorite features of 2024, even though I'm not using it right now, is this stroke type drag stamp, because if you do need the strokes to be exactly the same size, you can use that, and dragging just changes the intensity, not necessarily the size. But in this case, I'm using drag rect because I want the size to be a little bit different for each one of these pits. I'll do some up here. And something like that. It's kind of cool. A few more. This kind of like this kind of pattern is another thing that kind of adds a lot of visual interest to the design, because the eye seeks out, or I should say the brain seeks out patterns. You know, so the patterns are not exact, it's even more satisfying. It's like providing the brain with a little bit of a puzzle. But the other thing is, from the insect design point of view, I'm going to use each one of these as a placement for a hair, as close as possible. So they have kind of rows of hairs coming out like I see in a lot of these guys. They may be even on the inside. All right, something like that. Let's give that a try. So now, let's save this real quick. I'm going to do a quick experiment using some fiber mesh and some masking. So first let's create a mask, and I'm going to create a mask for just those little points there. A few ways we can do this. We could try, first of all, going into mask by cavity. That's a little bit, that's kind of overall, and it includes some of the noise that I created earlier. We could go in here to the cavity profile and play with this a little bit. That's making things a little bit more masked. It's a little bit less. That might not work. We can go here, mask by smoothness. Let's see how that goes. That's pretty close right there. So that's giving us masking. And it'd be nice if it was a little bit tighter. So let's see if I bring up the range here. It's probably going to expand it. Yeah, that's less tight. So let's bring down the range. That's not bad at all. Let's see. Is that actually masked? Yeah. So let's set the range to like 5. And reduce the fall off. Maybe increase the fall off. I really want to see what's being masked. I can switch to this flat color. It's a little bit too much, so now let's try mask by curvature. And mask by peaks and valleys. There we go. So we got that. Maybe I'll just hold the control key, control and alt, and just, you know, clear out some of the smaller bits right here, but it's not too bad. A little bit of randomness is okay. I don't think I want them right here though. The other thing I could have done is actually turned on RGB for my Damien standard brush when I made these little dots, and then poly painted at the same time, and then convert the poly paint into mask. That's another option. Let's say something like this. I'm going to leave it a little bit sloppy intentionally, and let's go down here to masking and boost that mask a little bit, just to make it a little bit. Actually, let's do this. Let's shrink mask and then boost mask. Something like that. Sharpen mask. Okay, something like that. And then go back to my blue material and let's play with some fiber mesh. So I'll go in here to fiber mesh and let's choose preview. So that's a little bit too silly. Let's go to white material so it's easier to see. And I'm also going to set my base color to white and my tip color to white just so it's easier to see. Okay, so we got a bit too much there. So now it's time to play with some fiber mesh settings. Basically, I just want like 1 or 2 hairs coming out of each one of those little dots, right? So we can lower the coverage, and well, actually, let's bring in the coverage, and let's do by mask and then lower by area. Bring down the max fibers. There we go. It's a little bit more reasonable. A little bit long, so let's bring down the length. Again with the project save, so let's take a sip of beer. Check out the chat here real quick. How do you get your panning camera to move around this model? Oh, it might be because the question is, great stuff, how do you get your panning camera to move around the model so smoothly? The answer is I'm using a Space Mouse. So Space Mouse is allowing me to kind of, as I work, I can take a look nice and slow and rotate. It also saves a lot on my my left hand. So check out Space Mouse. Great company, good product. Thank you for allowing me to make an endorsement. Let's go here to the gravity and set the gravity to 0 so that these are a little bit straighter. Let's bring up the coverage a bit so they're a little bit thicker. Let's see, now it's a matter of just kind of like getting the variation down and the clumping down, and let's see, I don't want any twist on here. I want these as straight as possible. Probably requires some grooming. Usually when I do hair for the final model, I will do in my either Paint Effects or like Yeti or something like that. Fiber mesh is pretty cool too. Fiber mesh is great when you're kind of concepting and just kind of figuring things out. So, as with all things ZBrush, twiddling with settings is the key. And let's make the length a little bit shorter. Okay, I mean that looks pretty good. We don't need to be super hairy. Anything else I want to do on here? I think that's okay. So I'm going to go and choose accept. It's going to make another subtool. Of course I have the solo button on, so let's turn solo off. And let's choose that fibers, and let's rename it. We'll just call this mandible fiber 1. And take like a grooming brush. Just use it to kind of straighten them out a little bit so they're not too willy-nilly. We do not want willy or nilly or willy vanilly, vanilly, vanilla, milli vanilla, vanilla ice. My brain stopped. Kind of fun experimentation. I think another way to go, like I said, is I could probably have a more precise mask if I'd use like RGB on my Damien Standard brush. I'm going to smooth these just to make it a little bit shorter. But this works pretty well. But hair is always important for insect design, even just a little bit. Wasps tend to be a lot less hairy than bees, but just a little bit of hair can really sell the design and make it look very exciting and a bit more menacing. If you compare this mandible to this one, you can kind of see what I mean. It looks kind of cool. Yeah, that looks pretty neat. Straighten that one out. Quick tip, let's say you want to straighten these things out, but you don't necessarily want them to shrink, right? If I hit these guys with a smooth brush, you see how they shrink? It's straightening them out, but it's also making them smaller, but I don't like that. So I can go into the brush palette, and under fibers, fiber mesh, I'm going to hold the shift key, which means I'm editing the smooth brush, and I'm going to set preserve length all the way to 100. And now when I hit it with a smooth brush, it will smooth those fibers out, but it won't make them shrink. So that can be a nice way to straighten them out a little bit without losing any of the length. That's available. That setting is available for any brush. Sometimes another great way to deal with fiber mesh is rather than using a groom brush, just use the regular move brush. That works as well. You can even, let's see, if I had the move brush activated under fiber mesh, if I set preserve length to 100, now I can move them around, but again, I'm not changing their length at all. The length is always the same. I mean, a lot of the groom brushes really are just regular ZBrush brushes with some of these settings applied. They're not that fancy. So I just created kind of my own groove move brush, smooth brush, right? So that looks pretty cool. Let's save that sucker. Okay, so we got a little bit of fiber mesh going on there. I want to bring out some of the details in this mandible, so I'm going to alt click on that mandible again. Let's rename it because it's still called Skin Z-Sphere, and I'll just call it Mandible. And I'm going to go in here and just, let's clear the mask, control drag to release and clear the mask. I'm going to hit the solo button. And I'm going to go in here and first of all, I'm going to store a morph target. Store morph target just so I can always go back to some of these details because I do like them. And then I'm going to go in here to geometry and let's hit it with the clay polish brush. I'm going to go clay polish. It's going to lose some of the detail, but you notice it leaves behind that mask. If I switch to flat color, you can see there's a little bit of a mask left behind from hitting that clay polish brush. I'm going to invert that mask. Let's go back to that blue material, Control H, just to hide the mask. So the mask is still applied. I've just hidden it with Control H, and I'll use maybe like inflate, and then come in here, whoops, and let's move. Let's go inflate, and just go with the inflate brush, maybe a negative inflate brush, just to bring some of this detail out. And I'm going to negative inflate with that mask applied and hold the shift key, and now we're getting something that looks really even more bug-like in my opinion. And this is one of those techniques I kind of discovered by mistake a long time ago. When I hit the clay polish and I started sculpting on the surface, and I noticed that weird things were happening, and then I realized it's because that clay polish button leaves a mask sort of lingering on the surface. But it's a very, it's similar to some of these other masks, like Mask by Smoothness or Peaks and Valleys. It's a very it's like on the edges, and you can go in here with the inflate and also with the smooth brush, kind of bring that stuff out. You get some cool looking details here. It's kind of stuff that you see like in electron microscope images. And do a negative inflate there. So I'm just holding the Alt key, so you get that. That looks a lot like the cracks that I see on some insects' surfaces. It's all that subtle, super realistic detail that I live for. And sometimes it just makes that surface noise even that much more interesting as a technique. So go up here, you can see how it's bringing out some of that surface noise even more, but in a much more organic way, and it's adding a lot of kind of stress in there as well, which is cool. I'll admit that I use this technique quite a bit, so maybe too much, but I love it, you know. You know, so all these living, I mean, it looks a little bit like leather there, so maybe that's too much. But I think if we have a shiny shader applied to it, it won't look quite so much like leather. It'll look more like, well, cracks in an exoskeleton. And the reason I like brushing this kind of stuff is because it's varying the intensity and that kind of thing, so it's not so uniform. Because what you want to avoid is too much uniform noise on your model, because then it'll look artificial. It'll look CG. Look like something out of the Scorpion King, right? You can also go in here and say the Damien Standard brush. Whoops, that's not the Damien Standard brush. This is. Let's set this back. Let's just go brush, reset brush, reset current brush, and just draw some lines on here while I still have that mask applied. Okay, I don't know if that's really doing what I want it to. Not really. Let's try the SK cloth brush. That to me looks really insectoid. You know, it's like you get really close like this and say, oh my god, it looks like you can see the individual polygons. Don't forget, you're really close to the model. I'm never going to render it probably any closer to this, so it's an easy trap to get into when you're like looking at microscopic detail and trying to, if your model is subdivided and your subtool is like 150 million points, you're probably going overboard. So pay attention to how close you think you'll be to the model in the final render. So this looks kind of cool. And again, I could also use the extractor brush to extract some of this kind of detailing and use it on other models. But that's kind of what I like. I'm going to control, drag, and release to clear the mask, and so you can see now there's the mandible. So that's what we got now. And you can compare it to the other mandible, which is where we started. Now, I'm actually going to move on to another part of the model rather than, I might redo this or add detail to this mandible offline, because it's going to be the exact same process that I used for this. So it's just repeating everything I've already done. Maybe there's some value in that. But I did want to point out, it's like one of the things, like I like this surface noise that I used as the generator for this kind of thing several steps back. But if I go to this subtool right here, Let's subdivide that up to a couple million. And I go to surface and I choose noise, and this is it's putting me back to the default noise settings. So each subtool reverts to the default noise settings. Right, default noise settings. So, but I want to have the same noise that I had on this subtool on this one. But luckily, you know, see there's a copy and paste option. So what I can do is I can go back to this subtool, right, where I generated that noise. I'll turn on noise, go into edit. You can see that's the noise that I designed. This is the custom noise. I can save this as a noise file and load that for future projects if I really like it. Or I can also choose copy to copy these settings. I'm going to choose cancel, turn off the noise there, go into this subtool, choose noise, paste, and it will paste those settings, and now I can choose OK and apply to mesh. So you can copy and paste noise from one subtool to the next if you want to be consistent across the whole model. The other thing is you can also, when you save the tool, it's going to save the noise settings with the tool. So any noise that I apply, if I close ZBrush, come back later, open up that tool, turn on noise, those same settings will be there. So that's another nice feature. Can you layer the noises? You can layer the noises. You could apply different surface noises if you're using 3D layers, you would basically turn on the noise and then apply the noise while that layer is in record mode. Then go to another layer, same thing, do a different noise, apply to mesh while the layer is in record mode, and then you could, you know, shift the strength of those layers individually if you wanted to play with the strength of noise. I don't usually use 3D layers just because it's not my style, but it is, if you're into 3D layers, you can definitely layer the noises. And then of course you can also keep applying the same noise or apply different noise settings to the same subtool and, you know, go that way. So that's another option that you have. But it's definitely one of my favorite aspects of ZBrush. So let's go up here to the head here, and let's take a look at this. So this is 1.3 million. So let's go in here under geometry, and let's subdivide it. 5 million. That's probably good enough. You don't need to go too crazy. I do currently have symmetry on here. Let's turn on solo, and I'm gonna go in here with the SK cloth and just, actually I might turn off symmetry at this point because I've already got kind of the basic details sculpted, and I don't want to make this too symmetrical. I want it to be asymmetrical, so it'll look much more natural. A lot of times when I'm working with symmetry, depending on the model, like if I'm working on, say, the thorax on one side, that'll definitely turn on symmetry because it's almost impossible to look at both sides at exactly the same time. So might as well use symmetry to save time on that, you know, and then you could break up the symmetry a little bit later. Or what I'll do is I'll have symmetry on for most of the sculpting process, and then towards a later stage when I do fine detailing, I'll turn symmetry off and do another layer of detail, just so I take advantage, you know, because symmetry of course is a huge time saver. So I like that aspect of it, but too much symmetry is going to look artificial. So I'm going to do this kind of thing, bring out some of these details. So just kind of creating that kind of look of tension here by creating these lines, a little bit of damage. I also like to work fast when I'm doing this kind of thing. So I get that kind of like loose kind of quality to it. So I'm not like fretting over every single stroke. Some of the techniques I used are designed to make it look like I spent more time on it than I actually did. Not that I'm spending a lot of time caring about it, but it's like I like to work fast. Especially because, you know, I mean, fast is relative. I'm drawing these lines fast, but remember, I'm just doing the head now, and I've already spent almost an hour on one mandible. And I still have, you know, head, the thorax, the abdomen, the legs. Legs can get kind of tedious, but just put on some cool music and then you're fine. Let's turn on transparency here. You know, I like to, you know, I'll draw a big thick line and then hold the Alt key and draw a line on top of that to kind of split it. That kind of looks very natural to me. Sorry, we're doing an autosave now. I'd hold the escape key to stop this, but you know it's just going to crash ZBrush, so I'll just let it go and check out the chat here real quick. Excuse me for a moment. Okay. So yeah, I like that kind of looking of the split there in the line. Okay, so what I have here is this is part of the head is coming through the mandible. So I'm going to Alt click on this, and let's go down to a lower subdivision level. Get the move brush and just pull this out a little bit. Actually, let's do this. Let's go back to this one, and there we go. Okay. Go back to Escape Cloth, and go up here to this bit. So I like to bring out some of these details I've done before. Maybe do a little bit of a line just along the edge of the eye. It's a really cool book called Evolution's Witness. It's a big book. It kind of looks like a coffee table book, but it's worth checking out. It basically traces the evolution of life on Earth. Hopefully that's not too controversial a topic, but it focuses, I'm sorry, that's a bit of a pun. It focuses on the evolution of the eye, because the eye has evolved several times independent throughout the story of life on Earth. It's a really awesome book. Highly recommend it. You learn a lot about how the eyes develop. But eyes basically start as a photoreceptive cell. In other words, a cell that is sensitive to light. You know, light is basically electrochemical signal, right? So cells become sensitive to it, And over the course of evolution, they evolved things like clear coatings, which become lenses that allow to focus the light more on nerve cells, and then eventually a brain that can create a picture from that focused light, but in many different ways. So if you guys have probably watched famous mantis shrimp videos on YouTube, have incredibly complex eyes that can see much more of the electromagnetic spectrum than we can, and seeing 360, and it's just an incredibly weird and wild and wacky eye. For just a little shrimp. But I really like that book. It's a cool one. I have to adjust that antenna a little bit later on. Creating kind of a look of like, it's almost like creating kind of like stretched muscle, but I don't want it to end up, you put a shiny shader on it, translucent shader, it won't look like muscle, it'll look like dents and stretch marks within the exoskeleton. Goes. That is cool. This is right where the mandible comes in. Alright, so it's nice and asymmetrical. Let's go over to this side. And just kind of creating a edge here around the eye, so it looks like it's more of a natural transition. You can also get noise brushes. I believe Pablo has a series of insect noise brushes that are pretty cool. I kind of like hand sculpting the details personally. That's just my style, but you can also check out, and other places like ArtStation has them. I might release my own series of brushes eventually when I get around to it, if people are interested in that kind of thing. I like brush design. It's one of the more, I think the amount of control you have over the brushes in ZBrush is what sets it apart from all other digital sculpting applications, because it's impressive. I mean, all the stuff in the brush palette combined with the alphas and the stroke style and other aspects, it just means that there's so many different things you can do with the ZBrush brush. It's almost unlimited. Pretty much anything you can think up, there's a way to do it with a brush in ZBrush. Hey, cool, Tattoon. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed making that one. I love jumping spiders. I made an animation many years ago of a peacock jumping spider. It came out okay. I think I might have to revisit it at some point. But I rendered it a mental ray, if it gives you an idea how long ago I made that. Remember mental ray? No. I remember actually working professionally at a studio, I think it was you and company, where we were rendering with Maya software for production. Maya software for production. That is old school and really not fun. Designing cool shaders in Maya software, yuck. Of course, I need to say this in old-timey voice, I also remember modeling characters with NURBS and creatures with NURBS. That's no fun. I think everybody should try to model a human ear using NURBS surfaces, just for the experience, the sheer hell of it. Let's see if you can get something good looking. One of the first professional animations I did was a beating heart, human heart, using NURBS surfaces. Oh my god. Animating the heart muscles moving and the valves opening and closing using cluster deformers, lattices. Ugh. And then rendering with Maya software on a Silicon graphics machine. That's old school, baby. Don't have any stable diffusion back then, I tell you what. And it's almost like we had to climb into the machine with a flashlight to light the scenes, you know. Okay. Yes, memories. Misty, watered colored memories. Working late at night in the studio, just trying to get something that looks almost like snow. Whew. Here's a really cool old Gnomon workshop video. I don't know if it exists anymore. It was on VHS tape. Alex Alvarez doing creature texturing on NURBS surfaces with all projecting the textures onto NURBS surfaces. No UVs. Wow, I did that one all the way through. And I was watching it on VHS tape too. And I almost quit CG. Not because it wasn't a great series, it was, but it was just so hard to get it to work. Especially when you had a character made up of NURBS patches and you had to keep the patches together as you're animating it. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Looks kind of cool. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to spend too much time in the back of the head, just a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go into surface. Oh yeah, the sub-D modeling, that was like, oh, this is so much better than NURBS. It's only slightly better than NURBS. Let's go to noise, and I'm going to choose edit, and I'm going to choose paste. Is it actually working? That looks kind of funky. Something weird is happening there. Aha. It is using... There we go. It was using the noise plugin, which was still the hexagon noise from the eyes, which just goes to show it does save the settings. That looks kind of cool. Okay, so we have that, and then I'm going to choose apply to mesh. And let's go into the stroke palette. Maybe do adjust last, pump it up a little bit, turn noise off. That's okay. Did it actually do anything? Let's see. Let's go in here and do... not really. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Damien standard brush. go back to drag rect, this alpha, and I'm going to start creating. And I think this time, let's do, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to go in here and turn on polypaint, and I'm going to switch colors. Turn on polypaint for everything so you can see. Okay, so actually no, I'm going to switch color here. Let's do this. Yeah, switch color. That way, is it working? I'm going to turn on RGB. There we go. This way, each time I make a dot, it's actually going to color it black. And the reason I'm doing that is then once I'm finished making these dots, I can use that poly paint as a mask so that I can then use the mask to place the hairs on the head. Kind of like what I did with the mandibles, but this way I don't have to try using that masking method that I was using before, which was a little bit imprecise. It still kind of worked, but maybe it'll be less work here. Let's take a look at the head here. We've kind of got hairs along these edges like this. It's not, well, we do have them coming out of these bits too, so let's do something like this. Yeah, I think, you know, when ZBrush first came along, it's just, you can't overstate how incredibly liberating and revolutionary it was, because a lot of software packages back in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s were promising a sculpting-like experience. Like the Maya had its own artisan brushes, and there were others, a Mappy, other kind of 3D applications that were all like, this is just like sculpting in clay, and it never was sculpting in clay, like sculpting in clay, until ZBrush came along, and that actually started to really feel like it. Although ZBrush was still very different back then, because you had to use Projection Master to do fine details, which means you had to temporarily drop your model onto the canvas, go into Projection Master, use the 2.5D brushes as a way to sculpt your detail, and then pick up the model again when you were done. And there was always a chance that something could go kind of funky, like you'd have a little point that would be off into the distance 1,000 miles away from your model, virtually speaking. You had to smooth it down, so that was never fun. But still, it was a lot better than what was on the market at the time, so it was really definitely very revolutionary. I started using ZBrush, you know, I first encountered it like in the early 2000s, and I think I saw at a Macworld in New York. Remember Macintosh? Remember when Apple used to make computers? I was at a Macworld, and the ZBrush booth was way in the back, and it was teeny tiny, and I saw, I think Fair was doing a demo of it. And I was like a big Lightwave fanatic back then, because Lightwave was a good modeler. But ZBrush was mostly 2.5D at that time. So I wasn't super interested in it. I had a demo of it, and I played with it for a little bit. But I was like, yeah, but this is 2.5D illustration. I'm into 3D. And then all of a sudden it turned into this amazing 3D program. So around about 2004 is when I started using it religiously. And I have a lot of crappy models from those days, but hey, that's how you learn. If you learn everything from just watching demos, then anybody who's ever been to a concert would know how to play a musical instrument. That is not exactly the case. You gotta go through the practice, the hell of the practice to get there. Unless you have an AI, and then of course it's instantaneous, and any knucklehead can make an awesome image, right? You can tell it's later on in the live stream because that's when I start talking weird crap. So I'm just making these dots here and kind of inlines to create kind of an interesting pattern. Goes along the edges, but not strict lines, so that there is some kind of randomization. Definitely the antenna will have more hair on it because hairs on insect act as, you know, on our skin, of course, we have the luxury of nerves just beneath the skin that allows us to literally feel things like pressure and other things in the environment. Of course, we also have hairs too, right? And obviously the hairs in my arm are really keeping me that warm. So they're there for sensitivity, obviously. With insects, hairs can act kind of like a trigger. They have like a trigger mechanism underneath. So as the hair moves or pressure is applied to it, it bumps into a cell just beneath the exoskeleton. So even though it can't really feel through the exoskeleton the same way we do, it can use the hairs to feel pressure and that kind of stuff. But the other thing is that the hairs can also act as chemoreceptors. So if there are pheromones or other chemical compounds in the air, the hairs will pick them up, just like we have hairs in our nose that will trap chemical compounds and bring them closer to the nerve cells so that we can actually sense what the chemicals are and smell things, right? So that's why hairs are so important on your insect designs. And they also just make it look real, and you throw on depth of field and nice lighting, and it really starts to sing. It makes the renders look that much better. Anybody who spent time studying cell biology knows that, you know, cells have protrusion. Not all cells, but some cells have protrusions called cilia that are basically hairs, right? So it's something that comes from the cells themselves. I'm not an expert in cell biology, but I do find it a really cool topic. It's one of my favorite things to... I've had the luxury of being able to animate a lot of cell biology when I was working at Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Also when I was working at Digizyme, which I do frequently. In fact, I did a project for Digizyme just last year. Kind of a cool documentary on bacteria and the microbiome. And then I got to do some cellular animations for the Griffith Observatory Signs of Life planetarium show. So we actually get to fly through a cell in that show, and that was a lot of fun. I got to model and animate a tardigrade, as well as some other little water critters. So that's really cool. If you're in LA, go watch Signs of Life at Griffith Observatory. It's a fun show. All CG, 30 minutes, projected on a dome with a live narration. We got to animate, was it 60 frames per second, 8K renders, It was a hell of a render, I'll tell you what. So we had a dedicated render farm in the little studio that we used. I think that looks pretty cool. I'm going to make sure I have some more right here. What I can do is, since I already spent some time coming up with the fiber mesh preview settings for the mandible, I can just copy those settings to this one, to this subtool, which should save a lot of time in fiddling around. I'm going to speed this up a little bit because we got about 15 minutes left here. Yes, yeah, good point. They're also sensitive to electromagnetic fields at that scale, definitely. Excellent point. I got into a discussion with a friend of mine because he was making fun of somebody who had a pet tarantula, and the person with the pet tarantula kept talking to the pet tarantula, and my friend was like, the tarantula can't hear you. And I'm like, yes, it can. It's covered in hairs, man. And totally sensitive to everything that's going on. It just doesn't have ears. Its whole body is an ear. Like, spiders aren't watching you. They're listening to you and smelling you. Okay, let's see how this looks. I'll get a little fiber mesh going here. Let's do a few more up here. Here's a case we're going to turn on symmetry and have kind of a ring of hairs that go around the outside of the eyes. Yep. I haven't, one thing that I haven't modeled is the mouth parts here. I mean, I've got mandibles, but there should be more mouth parts, so I'll probably get to that in a future live stream. But I felt like detailing tonight, so that's what I'm working on. Okay, so I have this, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go down to masking, and I'm going to choose mask by color, mask by intensity, and then I'll go in here to subtools and turn off polypaint and switch to color. So now you can see that in each one of those little dots I have a mask. So now what I can do is go in here to fiber mesh, wherever it went, fiber mesh, there we go. And if I do preview, of course, I'm going to get this, which is not what I want. So let's go over to this mandible here. And it's not far off. Let's try this. I'm going to go here, preview. It doesn't allow me to copy, but I can save. So I'll just save this as, I don't know. Fiber wasp, whatever, it doesn't really matter. And let's turn off preview, go back here, and I'm going to choose open Fiber wasp. There we go. Something like that. And maybe let's increase the max fibers a little bit. That's too much. 0.5 by mask. And now that's looking pretty good. Okay, and I'm going to choose accept. Go to that subtool, that fibers. Let's rename this. I'll call this head fibers. And let's get ourselves a groom brush. The other thing I want to do is I want to test this out. I'm going to do solo. And let's say we decide this white color here so it's easier to see. Let's say we want to prune some individual hairs. We should be able to do this. I should be able to go into ZModeler, hover over a face, choose delete, and let me see. I don't want to do all polygons. Let's see if we should be able to do an island, right? Let's see if that'll work. Yeah, that allows me to go in here, and I can delete individual hairs if I feel like there's too many coming out of one spot, like right here. I mean, this is a little tedious, but it depends on how picky you are. The other option, of course, is I could spend more time on my settings here, but I just thought I'd demonstrate that. I'm going to hover over this edge here and set the edge option to do nothing, and the point option the same thing, so that I'm only doing this. Point option, let's set that to do nothing. So that way I can go in here, maybe delete a few of these if I don't like them. So I just wanted to demonstrate that. I'm going to go back to my groom brush here and wherever it went. Did that. Interesting. Okay, so I think okay, well, learn something new. I think in doing that, by deleting those points, I destroyed the fiber mesh's tendency to stick to the surface. So let's see if that's true. Let's go back a little bit. Yeah, so maybe don't go in and delete individual fiber meshes, because if you do that, apparently it turns into regular polygons, and when I try and use the groom brush, it actually just moves them away. So don't do that. Don't delete individual ones with the ZModeler brush until you're done grooming. They can even sense your iPhone focusing on them for a picture because of LiDAR-based focus. Huh, that's interesting. They can also sense your thoughts and beam advertisements into your dreams. You know somebody somewhere is figuring out how to put ads in your dreams, right? It must be. Let's see if I like the way that looks. Looks okay. They look a little bit thick, so I'd almost feel like going back to the preview. In fact, I'm going to delete this because I don't like it. Go back to here. Go back to that preview of fiber mesh. And I'm going to make these a bit thinner. Yeah, that's more like what I want. Thought they were a little bit too thick. And then I'm going to bring down the max fibers again. Now choose accept and see how that looks. Now they're almost non-existent. Let's try that. I think that's better. Yeah, that's much better. What is going on here? Kind of cool. So what I think I'm going to do is I might work on this other mandible offline and then continue with the detailing next week, and also doing a little bit more of the adding some hair here and there, just using similar techniques. I think that's pretty cool. I think if I do a final render of this, well, I'm going to do a final render of this using Redshift for ZBrush once I get to the point of poly painting and all that kind of good stuff. So I might save the rest of the fiber mesh and the hair work for the very end, just so I can keep going with some of the sculpting. So I think that's where I'm going to leave off this week. And next week, Wednesday night, it should be Wednesday night, 7:30 Pacific. You can follow me on Instagram at bluepatone01. My website is www.bluepatone.com. And be sure to check out some of the Gnomon Workshop videos. Also, some of the previous live streams using this particular model, if you want to see how I got to this point and some of the techniques that I've shared. I think it looks pretty cool. I might do a little bit of changes to this part right here because I think it looks a little dull. Maybe I'll fatten it up a little bit and add a joint or something like that, because I've noticed that in some of the mud daubers, they're not always just completely thin like that. But otherwise, I'm kind of happy with the design so far. And we're going to continue next time. Thanks again for joining me. I really appreciate it. I hope you like the live stream. I hope you find it interesting. And I hope you, more than anything, you find it inspiring. It's my philosophy that I think that as CG artists over the years, we've been very good at studying human anatomy. When I started, everybody was terrible at human anatomy. Now everyone's an expert at it. So we need to start bringing the same attention to other invertebrates and making sure that our creature designs incorporate some science or biology based ideas in them, just to up the quality, always bringing it up, making everything better within the entire CG community and the entertainment industry. Cool. So see y'all next time. Thanks very much.